All right, guys, let's start. Is the volume okay at the back? Is that volume okay? Can you hear me? Up the back? Can you not hear me, or are you just ignoring me? Can you hear me at the back? Not very well. How about now? Is that better? All right, so just some admin before we get into today's lecture. Another reminder, this week's lab class will be on critical thinking in psychology. Read the Ryzen and Gilovich and Lakin and Chartrand articles before coming to class, and make sure you have access to copies of those in class. And submit your assignments, 8 a.m. on the day of your lab class. I hope they've gone well. If you are after an extension, read the manual and follow the instructions in the manual. I'm still getting emails from students asking me directly to grant an extension. I don't do that. I can't do that. There's a procedure that needs to be followed. So if you want an extension, extensions can be submitted up to 3 days after your due date. If you want an extension, go to the manual, read the instructions, and follow those. Okay, so today's lecture is on social influence, or how other people, influence the way we think and act. So I'm going to define social psychology loosely in the first lecture as the study of how social situations shape what we do, what we think, how we feel. And to the extent that that's what social psychology is, you can think of social psychology in essence as a study of social influence, right? Concerned with how other people, real or imagined, change what we do, and how we think. And consistent with that idea, a lot of the most influential studies in the history of social psychology, and a lot of the studies that have actually made it into the popular imagination, are about social influence. The Milgram study, the Ash study on conformity, these are things that, even if you haven't studied psychology, you may have come across through just living in the world. There are movies made about these things, and they're very, very influential in the history of social psychology. What I want to do today is just briefly recap some of these essential studies. Those of you who did first year would have been exposed to some of these. Those who haven't done first year, if you're hearing about these for the first time, these first 3 studies I'll talk about, and you want more information, any social psych textbook will give you that. After I just give you a brief recap about some of these essential studies, we'll then move into a more systematic exploration of different kinds of social influence, including obedience, conformity, compliance, persuasion, and a variety of factors that increase those things, some factors that decrease those things, and some mechanisms that explain those things. So probably the most famous study in the history of social psychology is the Milgram experiment. After the Second World War, social scientists, philosophers were puzzled by how an entire citizenry could actually embrace the atrocities perpetrated by the Nazis in the Second World War. Were these people intrinsically evil, or was it something about the circumstances that they found themselves in which drove them to do what they did? An initial attempt to answer this question was made by, influential attempt was made by Hannah Arendt, a philosopher and writer. She was commissioned by the New Yorker magazine to go and cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann, for war crimes in Jerusalem in 1961. Eichmann was the architect of the final solution, a war criminal. He fled Germany after the war to Argentina. He was captured by the Israeli Secret Service in 1960 and taken to Jerusalem for trial. Arendt went to cover this, and during the course of the trial, as is accounted in this book, and as is indicated by the subtitle here, A Report on the Banality of Evil, Arendt's conclusion was that Eichmann was not an intrinsically evil person. He wasn't a monster. He was just a normal-seeming guy who appeared to be following orders. That was her explanation. Her claim was that evil is rather banal. It's an everyday kind of thing that everyday people can do in the right circumstances, is a central claim here. That message has been, challenged by a variety of researchers and thinkers over the years. Stanley Milgram, a social psychologist, was interested in a similar question of whether or not regular people can do rather nasty things under certain circumstances. And what he did, as you probably well know, is set up a study. He actually ran 19 versions of this study, manipulating different parameters across the 19 versions. Everyone's only really sort of told about this central version. He wrote a book on this called Obedience to Authority, which is well worth a read if you're interested in this kind of research. It covers all the experiments that he did. The main experiment, as I'm sure you're aware, was set up as, or presented to participants at least, as an experiment on the role of punishment in learning. Participants come to the lab, they're led to believe that they are a teacher assisting a learner in memorizing various words. As a teacher, what they are meant to do is deliver electric shocks to this learner whenever this learner makes a mistake. The learners are confederate, they're not really being shocked at all. They're reacting in a way that leads the participant to believe they're being shocked, they're yelling out, they're doing all sorts of things. The question that Milgram was interested in is, under these circumstances, when an experimenter is instructing a participant in the teacher role to deliver potentially harmful electric shocks to an innocent person, what do they do, right? Do they resist? Do they conform? Do they go along? Or do they not? Before he ran the experiment, he asked colleagues of his at Yale in the psychology department and graduate students as well, how many people, what percentage of people do you think in this circumstance would go all the way to delivering quite harmful shocks of 450 volts or more to participants in this circumstance? These experts in human behavior thought 1% to 3% of people would go all the way and obey, even to the point of actually harming somebody else. 65% of people, in fact, go all the way to the end. So what you see here in this table, this is straight out of Milgram's paper. In the left-hand column, you see the different voltages that are represented on this shock machine. So what participants saw is a range of voltages from 15 up to 450. Every time the learner made a mistake, they were meant to move up one voltage lever, right? What you have in the right-hand column are the numbers of participants for whom the shock reported at that row was the maximum shock given. So what this says is no one pulled out of the study at 15, no one at 30, no one all the way to 285. Intense shocks. People are still going along. 5 people pull out here. The vast majority of people go all the way to the end, delivering shocks so extreme that words can't even describe them, right? Triple X. So what this shows is that when participants, when regular people are asked by someone in authority to do something rather nasty, a majority of them will. Very powerful demonstration that situations have powerful effects on our behavior. Another classic study on social influence, which is not about obedience, not about going along with an authority's request, but about conformity, which is going along with what a group does, was conducted by Muzaffar Sharif in 1936. He made use of a perceptual illusion called the autokinetic effect. If you are in a darkened room and you see a stationary pinpoint of light 5 meters away from you, it appears to move, right? And it appears to move different distances for different people. So he made use of this idea, this effect, I should say, and got participants to come into the laboratory, first by themselves, sit in a darkened room, look at a stationary pinpoint of light, and just report how far they thought the light moved. So the light appears to move for everyone. It appears to move different distances for different people. They do this a few times on their own. They end up stabilizing at a particular estimate of distance for the lights moved, and that's the end of the individual phase. What happens next over the following days is these participants come back to the lab and this time do the same thing in a group of other participants, right? So they don't do it alone, they do it with other people in the room, they themselves also giving their estimates of the distance that the dot moved. And what you find is that if you get them to do this group version of the task multiple times, they end up all converging on the same estimate. So, for example, this is data from the study. What you have here is a situation with three participants who, when they do the task alone, they end up stabilizing on quite different estimates, right, for the autokinetic effect, how far the dots moved. They come back and do their group sessions. As they do further group sessions, their estimates start to converge, come closer and closer together until they all agree on the same number. Now, this is interesting because in fact, the dots are not moving at all, right? And what you see here is that people are basically looking to others in this rather uncertain circumstance to get a sense of what the reality is, right? So they're going along with the group because they're kind of uncertain as to what the real answer is. And they're using others' estimates as information and going along in order to secure reality in that sense. These kinds of effects of others' estimates on the autokinetic effect judgments are long-lasting. Up to 1 year later, these sorts of norms that are developed in a group session still exert an effect on individuals' estimates. So this kind of going along with the group can, in some circumstances, have lasting effects on what people actually think. It's what Sharif shows with his autokinetic effect study. And then a more famous version of quite a similar study was done by Solomon Asch in the early 50s. He sets up a study that is ostensibly, the cover story is that it's a perceptual discrimination experiment. What participants are asked to do is look at the line on the left and say which of the three lines on the right is the same length as the line on the left. When people do this alone, no one makes a mistake. What Asch did, so this is a task where there is a clear right answer, and everyone gets the right answer when they do it alone. What Asch was interested in is how people would actually change their responses if in the presence of others who were giving incorrect answers. So he set up an experimental situation that looked like this. That's Asch there as the experimenter. On this card here are these sorts of pairs of stimuli. You have one real participant, this guy here, the guy looking confused, and you have 6 confederates. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is that right? Six confederates. Right? These are all actors paid by Asch to say particular things on particular trials. In the particular version I'll talk about of this study, there were 18 trials, so 18 pairs of these kinds of cards, each one requiring a different judgment. And on 12 out of the 18 trials, the confederates, right, these 6 people, were told by the experimenter to unanimously agree on an incorrect answer, right? So you can imagine the trial happening here. You have this guy says the wrong answer, this guy says the wrong answer, this guy says the wrong answer, this guy. It gets to the participant, and he's completely confused about what's going on, right? What does he do? Does he stick to his guns and give the answer he knows to be correct, or does he go along with the group? 75% of people go along with the group on at least one trial. 50% go along with the group on 6 or more of these trials. So what this suggests is that even in situations where there is a clear right answer and participants know there's a clear right answer, there is still a motivation to go along with the group. And this is usually taken as evidence of what you can call, I'll define this in a couple of slides' time, surface conformity, or just going along with the group to fit in, right? Unlike in the Asch situation, where there's uncertainty about reality and participants might be looking to others to actually get a sense of what's real, right? Here, the participant knows what reality is. They're not going along because they're uncertain. They're going along just to fit in, right? Not to be excluded from the group. That's the difference that's typically drawn between Sharif and Asch. So these are classic studies. Hopefully that's a refresher for those of you who've done first year before. If this is completely new to you, read a social psychology text. These will be described in detail. For our purposes, the point of these illustrations is that what other people say and do influences what we do, right? What we think and how we behave. These questions, as I alluded to in the Milgram study, were really sort of important questions for social psychologists, especially after the horrors of World War II. They're interested in why people were doing these horrible things. There's often an assumption of dispositionalism in explanations of behavior. We know this from the fundamental attribution error, which I mentioned last week, and you guys would have learned about in first year, which is the tendency to explain others' behaviors in terms of who they are, right? Their personality, their dispositions, rather than the situations in which they find themselves. What social influence research shows is that situations matter, and they matter a lot, and they matter in important ways. So a lot of what we think and what we do is actually a function of what others think or do. This is the essence of social psychology. Milgram shows that people are capable of doing nasty things when asked or pressured to by a person in an authority position. Sharif shows that social norms emerge during interaction and have a lasting effect on beliefs. And Ash shows that social norms influence behavior even for objective judgments, where participants know there's a right answer. So these are powerful effects. That's by way of introduction. What I want to do in the bulk of this lecture is probe some of these a little bit more, give you some more precise definitions, and make some distinctions between different kinds of social influence, give you a framework which we think of as a working model of social influence, which draws on the source of influence, so who or what is doing the influencing, the channel via which the influence occurs, and what attribute of the target or participant is actually being changed. Right? I'll elaborate this in a couple of slides' time, but this, I think, is a reasonable way of thinking about social influence, and if nothing else, I think it's a useful study tool or framework for organizing this sort of array of different phenomena. As I go along, I'll talk about some of the functions of social influence, why we tend to go along with other people. I've alluded to some of them already. And I'll talk about different influences, different influence processes, so different mechanisms, and different factors that increase influence or decrease influence. Moderators of influence, factors that amplify or attenuate social influence. So moderator, if I haven't explicitly mentioned it before, is a variable, a factor, that changes the size of a different effect. So a moderator variable is something that, in this case, can increase or decrease social influence. It's a statistical term that you'll learn about if you go along with psychology. But the basic idea is that I'll talk about some things that amplify or attenuate social influence. So that's what I want to cover. Let's start with a few definitions. Social influence, broadly, looks at the impact of others on our thoughts, feelings, and actions. There are different kinds of social influence. Obedience and compliance are quite similar. These involve acquiescing to or going along with requests. Right? If somebody asks you to do something and you go along with it, that is either obedience or compliance. Whether it's one or the other depends on whether the requester is in a position of authority or not. Right? So if the requester is an authority figure, so in the Milgram study, that's obedience because the experimenter has the authority of being the experimenter. In some versions of his study, they were wearing a white coat, which adds to authority. That amplifies influence, I should say. Obedience and compliance are about acquiescing to requests. Obedience happens when the requester is in a powerful position relative to the person being asked to do something, and compliance is basically the same thing when there's no power differential between the two people. Conformity is what was happening in Ash and Sharif studies. Converging, an individual converging on what a group as a whole is doing. So the convergence of an individual's thoughts or behaviors towards a group norm. I'll define norms in a little bit more detail a little bit later on, but you can think of a norm as what a group is typically doing. So if you've got a group of people, what the group on average is doing, that's the group norm. So conformity is me changing my behavior, my thoughts, my emotions to be more aligned with what the group as a whole is doing. Right? And so that can clearly be kind of seen in the convergence towards a single estimate for the autokinetic effect in Sharif's study. A distinction that, again, alluded to in the difference between Sharif and Ash is that between surface conformity and deep conformity, or public conformity and private conformity. You can think of this broadly as the difference between believing what the group norm actually suggests, or just going along on the surface and not really believing. So in the situation of public conformity, I might be inclined to change my surface behaviors, right, what I say or what I do, to be more consistent with what the group is doing, but I might not really believe what I'm doing. So in the Ash situation, that's typically thought of as surface conformity. Because there is an objective answer to which line on the right is the same length as a line on the left, and because all participants get that right when they do it alone, the assumption is when they give an incorrect answer, they don't really believe the answer is correct. They're just going along on the surface to fit in, right? So when you have a change of surface behavior without a corresponding change in underlying belief or attitude, that's public conformity or surface. When you get a deep change in beliefs or attitudes in internal mental representations, that's private conformity or deep conformity. Persuasion is another word for attitude change. Persuasion is the process of changing attitudes by communications. So if I attempt to directly change your attitudes by trying to convince you of something, by exposing you to propaganda, by exposing you to a particular message, that is a persuasion attempt. I'll talk about that towards the end. Okay, so there's some basic definitions, which I'll say more about as we go along. But let me now turn to this framework or basic model of social influence, which hopefully is a useful heuristic for you to make sense of some of these different kinds of influence phenomena. So at the broad level, we can say that in the presence of an influence source, a target's behavior and or mental states are different to what they would be in the absence of an influence source. If we can say that, we can say that social influence has occurred. So in the presence of a particular source of influence, if we see that a target or participant's behavior, attitudes, emotions have changed or are different to what they would be if that source was absent, we can say social influence has occurred. Source exerting influence via a particular channel on some attribute of the target. If we observe that happening, we can say social influence is occurring. Let's make some more subtle distinctions here. In talking about the various studies I'll talk about, I will make distinctions between different sources of influence. So as you've already seen in Ash versus Sharif versus Milgram, influence can come from a variety of different sources. In the Ash and Sharif studies, the influence source is a real group, right? A group of other people that are there with you when you are making a decision or when you're performing a behavior, right? Groups can also be imagined, so they can not be there with you, but you can think of a group and change your behavior to align with that group, right? So groups can be sources of influence, real groups or imagined groups. In the Milgram study, you have an individual source of influence. In this case, a person in a position of authority influencing you. So we have an individual in that case, groups doing the influencing in Sharif and Ash. The two channels I'll distinguish are verbal and non-verbal. So verbal is saying something, being exposed to language in some way, reading something. Non-verbal, my behaviors, some aspect of the environment that's not linguistically mediated. So in the Sharif, Ash, and Milgram studies, we have verbal influence occurring, right? So in all those studies, participants are changing their behaviors or attitudes or beliefs because of what other people have said. In other studies I'll talk about, no one says anything, right? Certain people do things, and the participant's behavior changes to align with those non-verbal cues. So two channels by which influence can work. And then there's a whole list of different attributes, properties of the target that might change under influence. So we've already seen how behaviors can change, how certain beliefs can change. Attitudes can be the target of influence. So can emotions, desires, all sorts of other mental states too. I'm going to focus on these three, behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs. These have been the most studied, I think, in social psychology. But you have other kinds of interesting social influence effects. For example, emotional contagion, which I won't talk about, where in a group, emotions experienced by some members of the group spread to other members of the group, right? Sort of like a contagion process. That's a fascinating area of social influence, but I won't be talking about that today. There's a long list of other things. So I think this is a reasonably useful framework. So whatever I'm talking about, a kind of influence, I'll try to clarify what the influence source is, what the channel is, and what the attribute is. Hopefully that helps you systematize your knowledge a little bit. Okay. So before I get into particular examples of combinations of these, I want to say a few things about functions of influence, why people are so influenced by others, be they imagined or real, groups or individuals. The basic idea is that we go along with others because it is good for us in certain ways, right? It's functional. It serves certain purposes. there are two general functions that social influence typically is thought to serve. Normative influence, or going along to fit in, we tend to do because it makes us feel better about ourselves, it makes us feel that we belong, it makes us feel that we're not excluded. So normative influence is thought to occur when people go along simply to fit in or to belong. Often, although not always, but often, this kind of influence is only happens on the surface, right? So you go along to fit in, so you don't feel excluded. You often don't also change your beliefs or attitudes in the same way, right? You're just going along on the surface to fit in. Contrast this to informational influence. Here you go along because you're just not really certain what's going on in the environment, right? You're in an unfamiliar situation, for example. You don't know how to interpret it, so you look to others for information, right? If others are acting in a particular way, right, maybe they know something that you don't. If you act in that way, you sort of get a grip on what's actually happening in the situation. That's the argument there, informational influence, going along to be accurate. And this is often private or deep. Because you otherwise don't know what's going on, if you go along with what somebody else says or does or believes, that can often sort of have an effect on these deeper psychological properties like attitudes, beliefs, and so on. So they're the two functions, normative influence and informational influence. And more is said on those two functions of influence in the Cialdini and Goldstein reading, which you have for this week. They talk about informational influence as serving an accuracy motivation. Normative influence as serving an affiliation motivation. They also introduce a third motivation, positive self-concept, going along to feel good about yourself, which you can read about in that paper. So that's why we tend to go along with others, to fit in or to understand how the world is. Let me just give you a few things a few moderators, a few factors that generally increase or decrease different kinds of social influence. So research tends to show that normative influence, so going along to fit in, tends to be stronger when you have cohesive groups. So group cohesion, the more tightly knit a group is, the more people are inclined to show normative influence. The more people tend to go along with that group just to fit in. Group size also has an interesting effect. The larger the group, the more influence is seen, but it tends to plateau at about groups of n equals 3, so about groups of three people. So group size increases normative influence, but it then tends to plateau. Social support for a deviant position tends to decrease influence, normative influence. So if I'm in a group and I have a position that's contrary to what most other people in the group hold, but I have somebody who's on my side, right? If I have social support for my deviant position, somebody who's with me, then that gives me some protection. I'm less likely to go along then with the group than if I didn't have that social support. Okay, so there's a few factors that generally influence normative influence. Informational influence, because this is about seeking accuracy about the environment, then it makes sense that things like self-confidence decrease informational influence. So the more confident you are that you know what's going on, right, the less likely you are to be swayed by what other people think. If you're performing a task that's really hard, you're more likely to be influenced by what other people think, right? Task difficulty means that your performance is probably not great. You're a little bit less certain about how things stand. You're more likely to go along with others. And what I think is quite an interesting study, stereotypes. Right? The information that comes to mind when you're thinking about groups also has a strange impact on influence here. So let me tell you about a study which I think is quite clever, done by Pendry and Carrick in the early 2000s. This is similar in many ways, sort of similar in structure to the Ash and Sharif studies. They didn't use an autokinetic effect task or a line comparison task. They used a beep estimation task. So what participants did was they came into the lab, and the central task they had to perform was estimating how many beeps they heard during this task. So they'd listen to a series of beeps. In fact, there were 100 beeps, right? And they simply just had to make an estimation. of how many there were. They did this in one of 4 conditions, right? So there were 4 groups of participants. Some just did this on their own, right? Just by themselves, listening to the beeps, estimate how many beeps you heard. So there's a solo condition. There are 3 group conditions. These people do the task in a group. They hear the beeps, and they then hear confederates, so actors paid by the experimenter, they hear them make their estimations about how many beeps they heard, and after they've heard those estimations, they make their own judgment. So much like the Ash study, right? They hear the confederates make their estimates, and they make their estimates themselves. The confederates were told to say something between 120 and 125 beeps, right? So they were in fact 100. The confederates were told to overestimate 120, 125. So the question is, what would the participants say? Now, the key manipulation for the groups was that before the participants in 2 of the groups made their judgments and performed this task, they were asked to think about either accountants or punks. So they were shown a photo of an accountant and told, this is an accountant, this is Norman and he's an accountant. Just think about that. Or this is Norman and he's a punk. Think about that. So the idea here is that they were exposed to a stimulus that activated the stereotype of these 2 groups, right? That set of expectancies about behaviors and characteristics of accountants. I'm sure you have stereotypes about accountants and punks, right? The key dimension, or one key dimension in which these stereotypes differ, is how conforming they are, right? Punks are the quintessential rebels, right? Non-conformists. Accountants, maybe not the quintessential conformists, but they're certainly much more conformist in stereotype than are punks. So what you have are people doing this task alone, right? Estimating. You have people doing this task in a group. In one of the 3 groups, you have people just doing the task after hearing the confederates make their estimates of 120, 125. In another group, you have people who are doing this task after they've thought about punks. And in the final group, you have people doing this task after they've thought about accountants. Does that make sense? So you've got 4 conditions. And here's what you find. In the solo condition, people are reasonably accurate, right? They estimate about 103 beeps. There are, in fact, 100, so they're quite close. In the no prime condition, so this is when they're still doing it in a group, but they haven't been asked to think about accountants or punks, they show conformity. They make judgments that are closer to what the confederates say, right, to 120, than they are when they do it alone. So this is a significant difference here. So you have some evidence of conformity consistent with what Sharif and Ash and others have found. Now, interestingly, when people are exposed to the accountant stereotype, they're even more conformist, right? They'll go along even more with what the confederates say. But when they're exposed to the rebel, to the punk, they show the same performance as if they were doing it alone, right? So if you have the stereotype of a punk, the nonconformist, in mind, that can actually change the way you behave, how susceptible you are to conformity. So what you have here is an example of information that's in your mind, active at the time, related to rebelliousness or conformity, can itself impact how conformist you are in a particular task. So that's sort of a brief intro to a way to think about social influence. A few different examples: Milgram, Sharif, Ash. Some functions for why we go along with others, to fit in or for accuracy, to sort of understand how the world is. And a few factors that increase normative influence, decrease normative influence, increase informational influence, and decrease informational influence. So that's where we are at the moment. What I want to do now is start moving through particular combinations of these variables, source, channel, and target attribute combinations, to start exploring social influence in a bit more of a sort of systematic way. So situations where you have real groups, right? These are other people in your presence as a participant, saying things to you which change what you do, your attitudes, so how you evaluate things, and your beliefs, what you believe about things. We've covered some of these already, right? So this quintessentially is conformity. A real group does certain things, says certain things, and it changes what you do or what you believe, and you move towards the group norm. So you see this in Sharif, you see it in Ash. The moderators of this kind of influence, I presented a few slides back. So those moderators of normative influence and informational influence are especially true of conformity. So that combination of things you've been exposed to already. What I want to do next is look at the interesting case of imagined groups. So here, you don't have others in the group in your physical presence, but you have them in mind. So let me talk about the case of an imagined group influencing what people do. So I talked about group norms as what groups typically do. You can have perceptions of norms, perceptions of what groups typically do, even in the absence of the groups actually being there, right? So you could have expectations about how certain kinds of groups typically behave, what they typically do. So a norm, as I mentioned, is a group tendency and behavior or belief, what a group on average tends to do or think or feel. There are two kinds of norms I want to distinguish between. A descriptive norm, which is what is actually done, and an injunctive norm, which is what is typically approved or disapproved of. So for example, if I were to say to you, 70% of Australians recycle, that is a descriptive norm, right? That is a description of the frequency of an actual behavior. If I were to say that 70% of Australians believe that recycling is morally good, or 70% of Australians believe or approve of recycling, that's an injunctive norm. Now, if I'm not directly observing these things, if they're just coming to mind, right, that's a perceived norm. So if I just bring to mind the idea that 70% of Australians they approve of recycling, then that is a perceived injunctive norm. These perceptions of what others actually do and what others approve of have a strong impact on the way people behave. So let me give you an example from a clever field study done by Goldstein and colleagues, including Cialdini. Cialdini and Goldstein 2004 was a reading for this week. That's the same Goldstein. This study was done in hotels in the context of trying to encourage hotel guests to reuse their towels. If you stayed in hotels recently, you know this is a big thing. There are sort of campaigns to try to get people to reuse their towels as an energy conservation strategy. Now, what these guys were interested in is how different approaches to encouraging towel use would work. And what they did was they compared a manipulation invoking a descriptive norm versus, you could call an appeal to principle, right? And let me tell you how they did this. So what guests, these are real guests in the hotel, they just come into the hotel, and what they do is they find on their towel rail in the bathroom a hanger like this. And there are two versions of these hangers that Goldstein and colleagues came up with. This one, help save the environment, is an appeal to principle. So what this basically says, I don't know if you can read it there, is help save the environment. You can show your respect. Oh, sorry, it's slightly different here. The environment deserves our respect. You can show your respect for nature and help save the environment by reusing your towels during your stay. Then it tells you how to do that. So this basically says the environment deserves our respect. You can show your respect for nature. It's appealing to this idea that the environment deserves our respect, a moral principle, if you like. In the other condition, the message on this towel hanger is join your fellow guests in helping to save the environment. Almost 75% of guests who are asked to participate in our new resource savings program do help by using their towels more than once. You can join your fellow guests in the program to help save the environment by reusing your towels during your stay, right? And they get the same instructions. So you have an appeal to principle here, or you basically have a message that says, everyone else is doing it, right? You can do it too. That works better. So this appeal to descriptive norms, telling people that the majority of others are doing the same thing, increases participation significantly over simply appealing to the idea that saving the environment is a good thing, the environment deserves our respect. So what you have here is the percentage of participants actually doing this, reusing their towels. 35% in the standard environmental message, that jumps up to 45% in the descriptive norm message, right? So encouraging people to go along with the group can sometimes be a much more effective strategy in changing their behaviors and appealing to their sort of moral goodness. In this case, the information about the norm was conveyed via language, right, in the towel hanger. Let me tell you now about perceived norms impacting behavior via nonverbal cues. NV, nonverbal cues in the environment. So this study, very clever, I think, another field study done by Cialdini and colleagues of his in 1990. What he did was, in effect, give participants the opportunity to litter in an environment that was clean, free of litter, or that was actually full of litter. And the way he did this was he set up this scenario at an amusement park. This was done in the field at an amusement park. And what he had his experimenters do was hand out flyers, right, to potential participants. And the way it was structured was such that participants would approach the experimenter. So I'm the experimenter. I've got these flyers advertising a particular show at the amusement park. Participants would come towards me. I would give them a flyer, and if they continued in that direction, there was a sort of a corridor of about 50 meters or so, I think it was, in which there were no rubbish bins. Right? At the end of the corridor, there was a chance to put the flyer in the rubbish bin and all the rest of it. But you basically give the participant a flyer, and they have this thing that they probably don't want, and they're walking with it for 50 meters, right? And the question is, what do they do? Do they throw it on the ground, or do they keep it with them to sort of throw out later or recycle later or what have you? The key manipulation was what that 50-meter corridor looked like. So what Cialdini did was he set it up so that along that passageway, there were pieces of rubbish or not, right? So the environment was littered or not. So what he did was he had, for some participants, there were no pieces of rubbish in the environment. For some, there was 1 piece, 2 pieces, 4 pieces, 8 pieces, 16 pieces, right? So you have this variation in how littered the environment was, right? You then have, as the dependent variable here, what's being measured, the percentage of participants that throw their flyer on the ground, right, in that 50 meters. And what you can see here is that the descriptive norm influences behavior here. So people's perception of what other people are doing in regards to littering changes what they do. So as more and more pieces of litter accrue in the environment, people are much more likely to throw their flyer on the ground. So people are inclined to violate a norm, right? So go against an injunctive norm, do not litter, when there's evidence that other people are also violating that norm, right? So this is I think, a nice demonstration of how nonverbal cues in the environment, so this is simply information about how many other people are littering in the environment, changes what you do. In this case, you have people violating a rule, like a norm or a rule, do not litter, because of what they see in the environment. You can extend this in interesting ways, and this was done by Kaiser and colleagues in one of the other papers I've asked you to read this week on the spread of disorder. So there was a theory, or there is a theory still in sociology and criminology called broken windows theory, which is the idea that in neighborhoods where there is evidence of vandalism, like broken windows, this spreads disorder. People are much more likely to commit other crimes as well, right? So the idea behind broken windows theory is that if you see broken windows, you're much more inclined to do other bad stuff as well, right? If you see evidence that people are being vandals, other crime also increases. Now, this idea hadn't really been tested very clearly, experimentally, until Kaiser and colleagues came along and showed that this is in fact true. What they were interested in is something slightly different to what Cialdini showed in the previous study. What Cialdini showed was that if there is evidence in the environment that a particular rule or norm is being violated, do not litter, people are more likely to break that rule themselves, that same rule. What broken windows theory suggests, though, is that if there's evidence that one rule is being violated, this spreads to other kinds of rule violations, right? So if I see that people are not obeying one rule or norm, I'm more likely just to disobey all sorts of rules, right? So that's the spread of disorder idea. So what Kaiser was interested in, what you can call cross-norm inhibition. So norm adherence, going along with rules, is inhibited or undermined by violations of other norms. So let me clarify what that means by describing the experiment. What they did a bunch of experiments in this paper. This is just one of them. What they did, again, the target behavior was litter. So how many people would litter in different contexts. But unlike Cialdini, they didn't manipulate how dirty the environment was in terms of how much litter there was. They manipulated whether a different norm was being violated or not. A different rule was being violated or not. So in this condition, which you can call the order condition, what you have is a situation where there's a sign that basically says it means no graffiti, right? This was done in the Netherlands, I think, this study. So that means no graffiti in the Netherlands. And what you have is an environment, this clean wall, right, that shows that that rule is being adhered to. What the experimenters did was put flyers on all these bikes. Participants will come along, take their bikes, take the flyer off, and either take it with them or throw it on the ground. So the dependent variable, what's being measured, is how many people throw this flyer on the ground, right? In this condition, you have a norm or a rule, do not graffiti, that's being adhered to. In this condition, you have exactly the same rule, it's being broken, right? So in this condition, what you have is evidence that people are disobeying or breaking the particular rule here, do not do graffiti. And what you see is that only 33% of participants in this condition throw their flyer on the ground, whereas 69% of participants in this condition throw their flyer on the ground, right? So this is similar to what Cialdini did, but slightly different. What you have here is evidence that if you see an environment where there is evidence of one rule being broken, that can spread to other rules, right? So the rule being broken here, that's in the environment, is do not do graffiti. People who are exposed to that are also more likely to break the other rule, do not litter, and throw rubbish on the ground, right? So you have this idea of cross-norm inhibition. Seeing violations of one normal rule can spread to people being less likely to obey other norms or rules. So this is a really clever field study, I think, which provides a nice experimental test of the sociological theory of broken windows and spread of disorder. Okay, so there's some evidence about groups, real and imagined, and how they change behaviors in interesting ways. I'll give you guys a 5-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about individual sources of social influence and different ways that they can change target attributes. So 5 minutes, eh? All right, guys, let's continue. So we've talked thus far about how real and imagined groups can influence various things via verbal and non-verbal channels. I want to shift now to individuals as sources of influence and start with the situation in which an individual's non-verbal behaviors can influence a participant's behavior. So the classic example of this in social psychology is called non-conscious mimicry. This is like copying what other people do without the awareness of copying what other people do. Non-conscious mimicry. The classic study in this was done by Tanya Charter and Jean Barge in 1999. Participants come into the laboratory and they interact with someone else who they think is another participant. It's, in fact, a confederate. They sit across from each other and they do this task in which they take turns describing pictures, right? It's the cover story. We're interested in how people talk to each other, how people describe visual scenes to each other. So they take turns doing this. And all the while, the confederate, who has been told by the experimenter what to do, has been instructed to either rub their face or tap or shake their foot, right? So you have participants who are interacting with a face-rubbing or foot-shaking confederate, doing this task ostensibly unaware of what the confederate is doing, face-rubbing or foot-shaking. And what you find, this is one of the sort of most, I think, oft-cited finding in reasonably recent social psychology, is evidence that people non-consciously copy what the confederates do. So on the x-axis, you have what the participant does. The bars are represented by what the confederate does. So black bars are represent the face-rubbing confederate. White bars represent the foot-shaking confederate. On the y-axis, you have the number of times that the participant did the particular behavior, rubbed his or her face or shook her foot. So what you find is that when participants are interacting with a face-rubbing confederate, they are more likely to rub their face than shake their foot. When they're interacting with a foot-shaking confederate, they are more likely to shake their foot than rub their face. So participants are copying what these confederates are doing. Chartrand and Barge engaged in a really thorough debriefing session after this, right? Asking participants what they thought was going on in the study. Did they have any suspicions? What were the hypotheses? And what they found is that participants did not know what was going on, right? So it's not the case that participants were just copying the confederate because they guessed, right, what the experimenters wanted them to do. They had no idea of what the study was about. They had no idea that they themselves were actually copying what the confederate was doing, right? Which suggests that people copy the behavior of others, and they do so without awareness. And once you know this, you see this everywhere, right? Go out now into the world and you'll start seeing this absolutely everywhere. People do this. They do it a lot. Why? The argument is that copying what other people do basically aligns you with them. It builds rapport. It makes you closer. The consequence of this is that mimicry tends to increase liking. So, in another study, in the same paper by Chartrand and Barge, they basically flipped the experimental context around. So instead of instructing confederates to do something and measuring what participants did, what they did was, in a very similar context, they instructed the confederates to copy what the participants were doing, right? So participants would just be performing their task and, just inadvertently, crossing their legs or leaning back in their chair or touching their hair. The confederate was instructed to copy what they were doing. At the end of the study, the experimenters asked participants how much they liked their interaction partner, right? The interaction partner who copied them or an interaction partner who didn't copy them. And participants like the partner that copied them more, more than the one that didn't copy them, right? So mimicry increases liking. So the idea here is that the reason we do this, one of the functions it serves, is that it brings us closer together, makes us like each other more. And this can have, I think, interesting and potentially useful consequences, especially if you are a waiter or a waitress. Van Baren and colleagues in 2003 did a very cool field study. This was a mimicry study. It was a non-verbal mimicry, so in the studies I've described, it's non-verbal mimicry. It's like face rubbing or foot shaking or something like that. You also have verbal mimicry, where you copy what other people say. What Van Baren did, using verbal mimicry, was... what Van Baren did, using verbal mimicry, was set up 3 conditions in a restaurant. This was done, I think, in Holland as well. A mimicry condition, a non-mimicry condition, and a baseline or control condition where the people receive no instructions. What was of interest here is how much patrons of this restaurant would tip a waiter or a waitress who copied them, who intentionally didn't copy them, right, or just left free to do whatever she typically does. And in the verbal mimicry condition, the waitress was instructed to repeat, basically, in as non-crazy a fashion as possible, repeat the key aspects of what the customer said to her during the order, right? So the waitress comes up to the table and says, "What would you like?" The customer says, "I'll have the duck risotto." The duck risotto, right? "What else would you like?" "Oh, I'll have a glass of red wine to drink." Glass of red wine. So verbal mimicry, copying what the participant says. In a non-mimicry condition, the waitress was explicitly instructed to not copy, right? Not repeat what the customer said. They were instructed to convey that the order was still understood. So I'll have the duck risotto, okay. I'll have a glass of red wine, writes that down, okay. Doesn't repeat what is said, but conveys clearly that the order is being taken and understood. In the baseline condition, the waitress was free to do whatever she would typically do. And what was of interest is how much customers would tip these mimicking versus non-mimicking versus baseline waiters and waitresses. And what you find, this is in Gilda's, you basically find that customers are more likely to tip a mimicking waitress than a non-mimicking waitress. And the baseline condition is somewhere in the middle. Presumably, in the baseline condition, when waiters and waitresses aren't given any clear instructions to mimic or not, there is some moderate amount of mimicry happening, right? But if they intentionally, copy what the other people are saying, they get more tips. So use that how you will in your own lives. So that's an interesting behavioral consequence of this. The idea being here, although this wasn't tested directly, that mimicry sort of fosters liking and builds rapport here, and one of the consequences of that in this, in the restaurant context, is that you'll be tipped more if you're a mimicking waiter or waitress. So that's the function it serves, building rapport, increasing liking. Via what mechanism does mimicry occur? There are various ways to answer this question. One cognitive explanation, appealing to mental representations and how they work, has been termed the perception-behavior link. The basic idea here is that the reason that we typically copy what other people do is that when we see somebody do something, we represent that mentally in our own motor systems, right? So we don't only form a mental a perceptual representation of what that person is doing, we actually have this sort of activation in our motor systems, right, associated with the very same behavior, right? So when we see someone do something, we have this direct activation of motor representations, which makes it more likely for us to actually go ahead and perform the same action. There is some behavioral evidence for the idea of this overlap between perceptual and behavioral representations. So in a study by Brass and colleagues in 2001, participants come into the lab, they sit down in front of a computer, they do a computer task, it's a reaction time task. They see stimuli that are hands that show a finger being raised, so a finger lift, or a finger tap, right? So they see finger lifts or finger taps, so a finger going up or finger going down. Okay. In some blocks of the task, they themselves have to perform a finger lift or a finger tap as the response, right, to the stimuli. So the task is, when you see the hand on screen move, right, so when it initiates the movement, we either want you to tap your finger or lift your finger, okay? So the response and the stimulus in some combinations overlap, right? So sometimes you have participants making finger tapping responses when they're seeing a finger tap, right? And sometimes you have people making finger lifting responses when they're seeing a finger lift, right? So you have this potential convergence, overlap between the stimulus and the response. And what you find is that, I'll talk you through this graph. On the y-axis, you have essentially the response time. So lower scores mean faster responses. On the x-axis here, horizontal axis, you have the movement that the participants observed. So what they saw the hand doing, lifting on the left or tapping on the right. The different lines represent what the participants themselves did, right, in response to the stimulus, whether they lifted or whether they tapped. What you see is that when participants see a lifting stimulus and are required to make a lifting response, they're faster to do that than when they're required to make a tapping response. When they see a tapping stimulus and are required to make a tapping response, they're faster to do that than when they are asked to make a lifting response. So what you have is the kind of stimulus facilitates the matching kind of response. When I see a lifting behavior, I am faster to perform the same lifting behavior, right, than when I see a different behavior. The argument here is what's happening is that when the participants see the lifting finger, for example, they perceive this, but they have active in their motor systems, in their sort of motor cortex, the representation subserving the very same action, right, that they themselves will perform. That gets activated on perceiving the behavior, and because of this activation, they're faster at actually performing the behavior. Does that make sense? So you get this facilitation of similar behavioral responses. And this kind of evidence is used to sort of claim that people have representations of actions in their motor systems when they observe those actions. Now, if you've done any neuroscience, or if you're interested in neuroscience, this will sound very similar to the kinds of ideas explored in work on mirror neurons, right? In various animals, including monkeys. Neurally, the claim is that in humans, we have so-called mirror neuron systems in the brain, parts of the brain that show activation when behaviors are observed and when the same behaviors are performed, right? The idea being that certain parts of the brain neurally implement this kind of representation overlap I talked about, right? Mirror neuron parts of the brain kind of neurally implement this kind of perception behavior link. Now, for the purposes of this social psychology course, the details of this don't matter, right? This is not a neuroscience course, but all I want you to take from this slide is the idea that mimicry occurs in part because of this perception behavior link, and that this is thought to be implemented in the brain in mirror neuron systems. Okay, so that's fine. Given all this, why aren't we just constantly walking around copying what everyone does all the time, right? If our brains are set up this way, why does it not happen all the time? Well, there are certain things that increase mimicry and other things that decrease mimicry, moderators, right, of mimicry effects, that give us some insight into why we don't do this all the time. And the basic idea is that because mimicry is designed, it's argued, to serve these affiliation goals, right, bonding with others, building rapport, if we have those goals, mimicry goes up. But if we don't have those goals, right, there are systems in place to sort of inhibit mimicry. That's the argument. Lakin and Chartrand, which is the paper that you have, I'm sure, all read very closely, you'll be analysing this in your tutorials this week, give you a nice example of the idea that rapport or affiliation-related goals increase mimicry. So in the second study in this paper, I'll just give you a brief recap of this. Hopefully this is all news to you. In the second study of this paper, participants were first given an affiliation goal or not. So some participants in this study did a subliminal priming task, right, which is basically got these words flashed to them on this computer screen related to affiliation, so friend, affiliate, bond, that kind of thing, under the level of awareness. So they weren't aware they were seeing these words. It was subliminal priming, but that kind of priming has been shown to work in the past. So some participants get this affiliation goal primed, others don't. That's the first manipulation. After this, participants are given the opportunity to fulfill an affiliation goal, if they in fact have one. They do an online interview with a confederate that's scripted such that the confederate is basically nice to them or not, right? If you have an affiliation goal, which is a goal to bond with others to make friends, and someone's nice to you, then the goal is fulfilled. If you have an affiliation goal and someone's mean to you, right, the goal is unfulfilled. So what you have here is some people have an affiliation goal at the first stage and some people don't. At the second stage, you have a fulfillment of the affiliation goal or not. Now, what they did then was set up a second interview, this time face-to-face, with a confederate who, like the original Chartrand study, was shaking his or her foot during an interaction, during the interview. And the dependent variable, what was measured, what was of interest to the researchers, was whether the participant would shake his or her foot and how much they would do that in these different conditions. So affiliation goal or not, affiliation goal fulfilled or not at the second stage, and then measure mimicry, right, and see when people mimic. What you find is that the key difference is here. And people don't have a goal, right? In the control condition here, they don't have a goal. If they have a good interaction or a bad interaction at this stage, it doesn't really make a difference for how much they mimic at the end, right? If, however, people have an affiliation goal here, right? This is the grey bar, sorry, this is the right-hand side of the graph. If they have an affiliation goal and it is successfully fulfilled at the second stage, they mimic this much, right? They spend about 30% of their time copying the confederate. If they have an affiliation goal and that goal remains unfulfilled, right, they mimic much more. The idea here is that what people are doing is using this opportunity to form this connection, right, in the second interview as a way to fulfill their otherwise unfulfilled affiliation goal. They have a goal active, they had one opportunity to fulfill it, and they couldn't, right? So then they get a chance to interact with somebody else, and as a way of trying to build rapport, right, and get the other person to like them, they copy them. Does that make sense? So what this suggests is that mimicry is sensitive to these sorts of goals. So one of the reasons that we don't always see maximum levels of mimicry is that we don't always have these kinds of affiliation goals. If we do, we tend to mimic much more. If we don't, we tend not to. Jessica Lakin's done other studies that sort of are related to this. So she's shown, for example, that if you ostracize people, like if you make them feel socially excluded, the first stage of an experiment, then give them a chance to mimic. Ostracized people mimic more than people who are not ostracized, right? The idea, again, is that being socially excluded engages this goal to actually reconnect, which you can partially fulfill by non-conscious mimicry. Okay, so that's some basic mechanisms and moderators of mimicry. There's other moderators as well. Group membership matters. People tend to mimic in-group members more than out-group members, right? They tend to mimic people in their own groups more than people in other groups. Powerless people, so relatively powerless people, tend to mimic more than powerful people. And if you're in a good mood, you tend to mimic more than if you're in a bad mood. There's a long list of other moderators. They're just some interesting ones for you to think about. Okay, so there we have individual non-verbal effects on behaviors, right? What I want to turn to now are where the channel is verbal. An individual source saying something to a participant and that changing behaviors I'll focus on for the moment. This comes under the broad banner of obedience and compliance, right? Obedience and compliance being about acquiescing to requests. An individual asks you to do something, do you go along or not? If you do, you comply. If the request comes from somebody in a position of power, and you go along, that's obedience. If not, that's just mere compliance. Milgram is probably still the classic study on obedience, and his many variations of that study show interesting properties of obedience. I'll talk a little bit about some of those in a while. I want to focus more on compliance. Going along with requests, if somebody asks you to do something, what makes it more likely that you'll do it? Usually, one of the other sort of defining features of compliance is that usually the target is aware of the influence attempt. So in the previous examples of non-conscious mimicry, influence is occurring, right? People are actually doing the same thing as their interaction partner, but they're not really aware that the interaction partner is sort of impacting them in any way. Here, participants know, right, that somebody's trying to get them to do something. So it's different in that way. What factors work here? So what increases compliance is what I want to focus on. There are a handful of things. Many of them kind of make sense. They're common sense, I think. But I'll talk you through some studies that show these effects in, I think, quite clever ways. So liking increases compliance. If you like the person making a request of you, you're more likely to do what they ask, not surprisingly. Various things impact how much we like others. Jenny will give you a full rundown of factors relating to liking in one of her lectures. Two of the biggest effects in the work on liking are that we like those who are more physically attractive. So we are, research shows, more inclined to comply to requests made by better-looking other people. We're also more inclined to like people who are similar to us in a variety of ways. And research shows that we are more inclined to comply with requests made by similar others. There's a cool field study done in the 70s on this. What these guys did was have Confederates who were dressed as hippies, or what they call squares, walk around university campus asking other people for a dime to make a phone call. This is done in America and a long time ago, and those things still made sense. So you have these people, different kinds of people, asking others for a dime to make a phone call. The Confederates were instructed to approach other people who either looked like hippies or looked like squares. So what you have here is essentially again, like a 2x2. You can think of a 2x2 table, right, where you have the Confederate, so the requester being a hippie or a square, and the requestee, the person being asked, being a hippie or a square, right? So if you think about those four different cells, you have two in which a person is being asked a favor by a similar other, when a hippie asks a hippie or a square asks a square, and the off diagonals you have basically this cross-category requests, when a hippie asks a square and a square asks a hippie. What you find is that similarity matters for compliance. If I'm a hippie and a hippie asks me for a dime, those situations, same with a square-on-square interaction, more than 2/3 of people provide the dime, go along with it. If there's a dissimilar situation, so a hippie asks a square asks a hippie, less than half go along, right? So similarity on the basis of this sort of category membership, social category membership, makes a difference for compliance. We are more likely to go along to the requests, with the requests of people who are similar to us. Authority also matters. So when an authority makes a request, we are in the realm of obedience. The more authority the person has, the more likely the request is to be obeyed. So I mentioned that Milgram did a whole bunch of different studies, 19 variations on his standard, his classic study. In one of these, he intentionally manipulated the level of authority that the experimenter had over the participant, right? So in the standard version, this was done at Yale. The experimenter was clearly kind of, a member of staff, someone with authority, the authority that comes with that prestigious university. In a variation of this, he did the exact same study in a rundown office in the downtown area of the city in which Yale is located. So that strips a lot of the authority away, right, from the experimenter, right? It's not being done at Yale anymore. This person is not a member of this prestigious institution. They're just somebody asking you something in a rundown office in downtown. What you find is that in the Yale version, which is the one I talked about before, 65% of people go all the way to the end, right? In the rundown office, less less than 50% of people go all the way to the end, right? So when you have less authority, you have less obedience. Another field study that shows this quite well was done again in the 70s by Bickman, a very neat field study. They had Confederates go up to people in the street and ask them to do random things, like, could you please go and put this coin in that parking meter for me? Could you take this piece of rubbish and go put it in that bin for me? The manipulation was simply whether or not the person doing the asking was dressed in a security guard uniform or was just some random guy in the street, right? And perhaps not surprisingly, you find that nearly everyone does whatever a security guard asks them to do, but fewer than half of the people just obey the random guy in the street. Now, it kind of makes sense if a security guard asks you to do something security-related, but going and putting like coins in the meter for him and throwing his rubbish out, it's a little bit bizarre, right? It doesn't really fit with the role of security guard, but you see the uniform and you do whatever he says. So authority matters. It changes the rate of compliance. More authority, compliance goes up. So there's two factors: lacking and authority. These are sort of properties of similarity between two groups, or an attribute of the requester. The next two things I want to talk about rely on injunctive norms that we all tend to hold, right? That say something about how we should behave when people ask us to do something, right? So the first thing I want to talk about is reciprocity. The norm of reciprocity suggests that we are obligated to return to others the goods, services, and concessions that they offer us. So the idea is that, generally speaking, in many relationships, if somebody does something for us, we're kind of expected to do something for them, right? There are limits on that, but there's a general norm of reciprocity that you return favors, basically. And this is really, really strong, and it impacts compliance. So if you're in a situation that is structured around reciprocity, you're much more likely to go along with what someone requests of you than if reciprocity is not there. A very clever study, I think, shows this. So this study by Reagan, participants come into the lab, they're with another person who is a Confederate, they don't know that, and they're making aesthetic judgments, right? They're saying whether they like certain things or not. This is just a task, there's a cover story around it. They do this for a while. The Confederate, while doing this task, is either being nice to the participant or not, right? So that you have a friendly Confederate or a rude Confederate. They do this for a while, and the experimenter says, you guys can have a break now. During the break, the Confederate gets up and goes out of the room. The participant's sitting there waiting for the task to restart. The Confederate comes back, and in some conditions, the Confederate has a soft drink, a cola, that he gives to the participant, right? Have a cola, or not. It's friendly or rude Confederate, cola or not, right? So offering something to the participant or not. At the end of the study, so then they make some more judgments and continues. At the end of the study, the Confederate turns to the participant and says, oh, by the way, I'm selling raffle tickets for blah, 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 doesn't matter what. Would you like to buy some? So there's a request to buy raffle tickets. Do the participants go along or not? Do they comply or not? Results. Number of raffle tickets bought on the y-axis. On the x, the situation where the Confederate does not give the participant a cola. On the right, the situation where the Confederate does give the participant a cola. Giving the cola sets up the possibility for reciprocity, right? I've done something for you. Now I'm asking you to buy raffle tickets. You should do something for me. None of this is said. It's just there in the norm. And it matters. I mean, what you see is that when you get nothing from the Confederate, no cola, people buy slightly more raffle tickets from someone who's nice, a friendly Confederate, and someone who's not. But that effect is swamped by the reciprocity norm, right? Even if someone's being mean to you, and they come back and give you a cola, you're likely to buy more raffle tickets, right? From them, if they were just if they were just nice to you the whole time, right? So the idea here is that norm of reciprocity is so strong. It just trumps basic interpersonal niceness, right? It sets up the idea that you've done something for me, so I feel compelled to do something for you, right? So the reciprocity norm, if it structures these interactions, increases compliance. If you feel that someone's done something for you, you're much more likely to do something for them. Okay, the next norm, and the final norm I'll talk about in compliance, is commitment. It's called commitment. It's basically the idea that we are required or obliged to honour our agreements and obligations. If we say we're going to do something, then we're expected to do it, right? And we feel pressure to do it. This can change compliance as well. This is all very useful for people who work in sales, by the way. And Robert Cialdini, who did a lot of this work I've mentioned a few times, he's got whole books on persuasion and how these techniques are used by used car salesmen and all the rest of it, which are fascinating reads. You see it all the time. If you want to be immune to some of these tactics, read Cialdini's work. Or if you are a used car salesman and want to go and make the most, then read his work as well. So commitment, this norm of commitment, is utilized in a technique that salesmen use called lowballing, right? Which is an intentional attempt to try to make you overcommit to something. So what you do in lowballing is you secure a deal first with a request of a particular size. Once you've got commitment from that person, you then increase the size of the request, right, by revealing certain hidden costs. So you get them to commit to something small first, and then you reveal all these hidden costs. And they feel obliged to remain committed because they've already said they'd do it. So they did this. Cialdini did this in a study which was quite clever, a field study, where he had his experimenters phone students, potential participants in an upcoming study. So they just called these people back in the day when you call participants to see if they wanted to participate in a study. And Cialdini instructed his experimenters to do one of two things. Either basically tell potential participants that they wanted them to come into the laboratory to participate in a study at 7 a.m., right? Would you like to do that? 31% of people say, yeah, I'll come and do that. In the other condition, he got the experimenters to so-called lowball first. So first, they said, would you like to participate in a study? The participant says yes or no. They say yes. They say, by the way, the study is at 7 a.m., right? Many more people are likely to sort of remain committed then, right? So to sort of fulfill their obligation, even when this hidden cost is revealed, right? So they've committed already. They've said, yeah, I'll do it. By the way, it's at 7 a.m. It's like, oh, shit. All right, I'll still do it, right? So when you do that, you get them to commit to something smaller, you reveal the hidden costs, and that increases the chances, that increases the likelihood that they remain committed to that larger request. So having made the commitment, participants feel obliged to follow through despite the hidden cost. That's lowballing. That hinges on this norm of commitment. Okay, so that's some interesting findings, I think, around compliance. We comply more with people we like that are similar to us, who are in authority positions, if we feel there's a norm of reciprocity driving things, if we feel that there's a norm of commitment driving things. The last, is it the last? Yes. The last combination I want to talk about is persuasion or attitude change. An individual, usually individual, sending a verbal message to somebody in an attempt to change their attitudes, right? Compliance is about behavior change, getting people to do certain things. Attitude change or persuasion is about changing attitudes, right? How people evaluate certain objects. So persuasion is synonymous with attitude change. They use interchangeably. They mean the same thing. Jenny Balderow, when she comes in, will give you a whole lecture on attitude. So I know I've talked about some attitude-related phenomena before now. She'll give you a much more elaborated version of what an attitude is and the history of all this work. An attitude is a cognitive representation that summarizes the evaluation of an object. Think of it simply as an expression of whether you like something or not, right? Attitude change is a process of changing attitude by communication or by being exposed to a message. How does attitude change work? So usually in studies on attitude change or persuasion, same thing, participants will come into the laboratory, they'll read something, and they'll read a message, right, about a particular issue or particular attitude object, and the message will vary between conditions, and then after that, they'll simply rate their attitude of the object, right? And what experimenters do is just compare the attitudes of people who have been exposed to these different messages to see how attitudes vary, right, as a function of different properties of messages. I'll give you some examples of these studies, but that's the basic idea. So attitude change or persuasion is the context in which you are sitting there, you're being exposed to a message, a persuasive message, and the question is, does your attitude change as a function of being exposed to that message? There is a long history of attitude research in social psychology. There's a long history of attitude change research in social psychology. Most of that, though, was superseded by dual process models of attitude change. These are the most important ones that were developed in the 80s. The most influential is called the elaboration likelihood model, developed by Richard Petty and John Cacioppo. The heuristic systematic model was developed almost at the same time by Shelley Chaikin. It's very, very similar in its nature. I'm going to be talking about elaboration likelihood model primarily. The key aspect of these dual process models is that they say that there are two routes via which attitude change can occur. A central or systematic route. Central is the language of the elaboration likelihood. Systematic is the language of the heuristic systematic model. A central route. This route is taken when people are motivated and capable of thinking carefully about message content. Or a peripheral route or heuristic route, which is taken when people are unwilling or unable to think carefully about the message content. So the basic idea is this. If I'm a participant sitting in the laboratory, somebody exposes me to a message that's meant to change my attitude. If I am motivated and capable, because I'm not distracted or what have you, of processing that message deeply, then I'm said to be in the central route, right? And what that means is that certain things will impact persuasion that work differently in the central route than in the peripheral route. If I'm in the same situation and I'm distracted or I don't care, I'm unmotivated, unwilling to process the content of the message, then I'm said to be in the peripheral route. Now, my attitudes might still change, but a whole range of different factors will drive attitude change in the peripheral route than in the central route, right? So there are two routes to persuasion, central and peripheral, and different factors drive attitude change in the different routes. That's the essence of dual process models. Before this, the assumption was everybody is processing the message in the same way, and there's a sort of standard set of factors that drive attitude change. That's not true. It depends on how you're processing the message. If you're focused or not, if you are capable or not, makes a huge difference. That's the essence of dual process models. There are a number of factors that determine which route you are in, central or peripheral. I've alluded to some already. So if you are in a happy mood for whatever reason, you tend to process messages in the peripheral route. You tend to be less focused on message content. If you are sad or in a negative mood, broadly speaking, you tend to process things centrally, in the central route. If you are engaging with an issue, if the message pertains to an issue that is important to you, then you tend to be in the central route, right? Be focused on what's being said. If you're engaging with something that is unimportant to you, you'll tend to be in the peripheral route, right? Not really paying attention to what's going on. There are certain individual differences as well. Standard, stable difference between people, right? That influence whether or not they are likely to process messages in the central route or the peripheral route. The most important one, which was also developed by Petty and Cacioppo in conjunction with their elaboration likelihood model, is need for cognition. This is an individual difference that measures the extent to which people enjoy and tend to engage in deep, deliberative thinking, right? Tend to think a lot and think deeply. Some people are high on this. They tend to like thinking a lot about things, and some people are low on this. They just tend not to like thinking about stuff in general, right? They're looking always for a shortcut. They don't tend to think deeply. People who are high in need for cognition will tend to more often than not be in the central route. People who are low will tend to be in the peripheral route when processing messages, right? So there are a handful of situational factors and individual difference factors that will influence the extent to which or the likelihood of which people will be in the central or peripheral route. Now, why does it matter? So the reason that it matters which route you're in is that different factors impact attitude change in the different routes. In the central route, let's start there. This is when you are motivated and capable of processing the content of the message. What matters here? The primary driver of attitude change when you're in the central route is message content. What is actually said in the message. Petty and Cacioppo in 1994 did a study in which participants came into the laboratory and they were asked to read an essay about advocating a particular change in academic policy at the university they were attending. So these are all students. They read an essay that was advocating for a comprehensive exam that all students would have to take, right, at the end of their course. So that's the issue that people are going to be expressing an attitude towards. Are they in favor of that, or are they against it? They come in, they read this essay. They're not told that attitudes are the focus of the study. They're told, what we want you to do is read this essay, and at the end we'll ask you a bunch of questions, including what do you think of the person writing the essay. So they're led to believe it was like an impression formation study, right? They're meant to be forming an impression of the writer of the essay. It's not about attitudes. They read an essay advocating for this exam. Now, the essays that they read, the messages they were exposed to were pre-tested and selected such that some of them had weak arguments and some of them had strong arguments, right? So before the study was done, Cassioppo created a bunch of different arguments, right, in favor of supporting this comprehensive exam, and they had other participants rate how good they were, right? Some arguments were really good, some arguments were really bad, and they constructed these different versions of the essay based on that pre-test, so that one version of the essay had lots of strong arguments and one version of the essay had weak arguments. The other thing they manipulated, which is really important, was the likelihood that participants would be in the central route or not. So remember on the previous slide I said one of the key moderators of likelihood of central route processing is whether or not the issue under discussion is important to you or not. So what they did was they told participants that this academic policy change, this comprehensive exam, was either going to come in next year, right, which would mean that it would affect them, that they themselves would have to actually do the exam because they were, early on in their degrees, and so that would impact them, or they were told that this policy change would happen in 10 years' time, which for most people in undergrad means that they'll be out of the university, right? So you have a situation where the issue is actually directly relevant to you, because you'll have to be doing this exam if it comes in next year, or not, right? It won't come in for 10 years' time. The idea being that those in the next year condition are more likely to be highly involved, more likely to be in the central route. Make sense? All right. Here's what they found. When participants are not in the central route, so low involvement, they don't care about the issue because it doesn't affect them, right? It's coming in 10 years' time. Over here, whether they get strong arguments or weak arguments makes absolutely no difference, right? On the y-axis, you have the attitude. High numbers mean that you are in favor of the policy. Low numbers mean that you are against the policy. The message was arguing in favor of the policy, right? So the idea is that, on average, you should see, if persuasion's working, people's attitudes towards the top. What you see is that when people in the peripheral route, which is this column, argument strength doesn't make a difference to people's attitudes. When they are in the central route, so when they're highly involved, because the change will come in next year, it will directly impact them, argument quality matters. So when people are exposed to strong arguments and they're in the central route, their attitudes on average move towards favorability, towards the thing being argued for. When they're exposed to weak arguments, it actually undermines the message, right? And their attitudes are sort of closer to disagreeing with what's being argued for. The short story here is that when in the central route, message content, and in particular argument quality or argument strength, matters for persuasion, right? And it doesn't matter. That's another important thing. It doesn't matter when you're not really paying attention, right? So I think usually the assumption would be that better arguments lead to more attitude change, but it's not always the case. It's only true if you are focused on processing the message, right? If you're not, argument quality doesn't make a difference. What happens now if you're in the peripheral route? What matters here? Argument quality doesn't matter. Other things matter. So in exactly the same study, this is exactly the same study. I glossed over one other thing that they manipulated. So we have argument qualities being manipulated, which I talked about now, but so is argument quantity. So again, it's the same situation. You have people reading the essay, implementing the change, arguing for the implemented change the year after in 10 years' time. One of the other things they manipulated was whether or not the argument, the message contained 3 arguments or 9 arguments. Message number, right? It's independent of message quality, just how many arguments there are argument number, I should say, 3 arguments or 9 arguments, argument number. What you find here is that argument number matters in the peripheral root, not in the central root, right? So when in the peripheral root, in the low involvement condition, happening in 10 years' time, doesn't matter to me. I'm swayed simply by these things that, kind of peripheral to the central argument, right? There's lots of arguments there. I guess, that's a good thing. So I'll change my attitude towards agreeing more. Argument quantity matters in the peripheral root. Argument quality matters in the central root. So the idea, the broad idea is in the peripheral root, so-called heuristics or peripheral aspects of the message have more impact than central aspects of the message, right? So central message content issues make a difference for central root processing. Peripheral things like number of arguments, like who is making the argument, right? Who the author of the essay is, these sorts of things matter when you're in the peripheral root. So other factors that drive attitude change in the peripheral root are source expertise. If you learn that the source is an expert in the area, you're more likely to be persuaded by that person, but only if you're in the peripheral root, right? Not if you're in the central root. If you learn that the source is attractive, physically attractive, you're more likely to be persuaded by that person if you're in the peripheral root, but not if you're in the central root. So, for example, this study by PSYC20009 and 1983, participants were females. They read an essay arguing in support of donations for the arts. And the only difference between the two conditions, they got exactly the same essay. There was a photo accompanying each of the essays in the different conditions. One was a clear photo of a handsome guy. The other one was a blurry photo of the same guy, so you couldn't tell what he looked like, right? Participants were much more persuaded by the attractive man than by the blurred man in that condition. Exactly the same content. The participants weren't focused on the content of the message. They weren't in the central root. They're in the peripheral root. And as a result, they're swayed by attractiveness of the source. So what matters in the peripheral root is not the essential content, the quality of the arguments, but this other set of peripheral factors like source expertise, attractiveness, number of arguments, that kind of thing. That's attitude change. So that's the end of the lecture. That covers a variety of different influence phenomena, different sources, different channels, different attributes. Hopefully that's a reasonably clear framework for getting you to think about that. Next week, evolutionary social psychology. So I'll come back and talk about evolutionary psychology and how it can help us explain social behavior. I'll see you then. Good luck with your assignments. Hey.
So the extension, you say that you could apply for one 3 days after each
Up to 3 days after.
Alright, because mine was due this morning, but I got pretty rankly sick yesterday and couldn't really see a doctor because they all closed at like noon.
Yeah.
So
you can submit it. You need documentation to attach though.
Yeah, I'm going later.
Yeah, so that'll be fine.
Yep.
No problem.
Sweet.
Cool. If there are any problems with the timing, because there's a reasonably sort of automatic kind of cut-off.
Because I checked it today and it said it was letting me apply for due dates tomorrow, and I was wondering.
Yeah, so it should be fine. If there's any issue, just send me an email, and there'll be some way to work around.
Yeah.
The system just has these like official kind of built-in requirements that don't work for everybody. So if there are any issues, just send me an email.
I'm handing them tonight anyway, so worst comes to worst, it's 1 day. But
Cool. All right.
Yeah, no, I'll look at it.